Always trust.
We ask the question, what is needed in the world? Is that going to
Gošća emisije Recite Al Jazeeri je Dalia Mogahed, jedna od vodećih muslimanskih aktivistica u Americi i autorica knjige Šta misli milijarda muslimana. Sa njom razgovaramo o položaju muslimana u SAD-u od početka izraelske agresije na Gazu. Dalia, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us now. Following the Hamas's attacks on Israel on October 7th, we have seen this wave of Islamophobic, discrimination throughout Europe and the U.S. You are somebody who has been working and living in the U.S. for for your entire life, actually, right? Yes. What is the magnitude of the current discrimination faced by American Muslims in the wake of the October 7th attack? And would you go as far as to compare it to the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks?
Thank you so much, Harun, for having me. And just to clarify to your audience, I not only have lived in the United States my whole life, but my work is specifically on American Muslims and studying Islamophobia in the United States as the director of research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. It's an organization that does research and education on American Muslims.
Right.
And to be very honest with you, comparing it to 9/11, to right after 9/11 would be an understatement. It is, in my opinion, far worse. I've never seen this level of hatred and hysteria in my entire life. We have never witnessed something like a 6-year-old boy being stabbed to death by his own landlord 26 times, and the man openly saying it was because of the media that he had been consuming about Gaza. 3 young men wearing kafiyas just a few days ago were shot. One of them, and they're all recovering in the hospital. None of them died, alhamdulillah, but one of them is said to perhaps never be able to walk again. These young men, at the prime of their lives, just younger than my son, have had their lives never to be the same because of their identity and their expression of solidarity with the Palestinian people. So no, Harun, this is not similar to right after 9/11. In my opinion, it is far worse.
Right, but do these forms of Islamophobia come from politicians, media outlets, or the population as a whole?
This form of Islamophobia is coming from the media and politicians and the dehumanization of Palestinians and Muslims more broadly. Now, I want to draw a very important link between Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian sentiment. They are not separate at all. When you look at the types of stereotypes and tropes attributed to the Palestinian people, when you hear Israeli officials calling them inhuman animals, or comparing them to rats, or saying that they are a pack of savages, as we've heard from even prominent so-called neutral Western journalists over and over again. What you are hearing are key stereotypes attributed to Muslims overall. And this is what we're hearing from political figures in the United States, from media personalities in the United States. And this impact is dehumanizing, specifically Palestinians, Arabs more broadly, and then Muslims even more broadly. So Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism go hand in hand. In fact, one report out of the University of California in Berkeley on the Islamophobia industry. And so for anyone who's not familiar what that is, it's an actual network of individuals and institutions, pseudo think tanks, whose entire mission is to churn out hatred of Muslims. This Islamophobia industry is 80% funded by sources in the state of Israel. So this is not a theoretical. I'm not making a sort of a a conjecture or I'm not making a link that I can't back up. Islamophobia is a tool of pro-Israeli campaigns in our country, in my country here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Now, how would you make sense of the fact that top-notch Ivy League universities in the US are shutting down pro-Palestinian student unions? Are they under a lot of pressure from the pro-Israel lobby, or is it by their own initiative?
Well, it's hard to say exactly what motivates them exactly, what is behind that. But I'll tell you a few factors that I think are very important to keep in mind. One is that the pro-Israel movement is much, much more organized than is any kind of Palestinian or Muslim organized movement here in the United States, especially on college campuses. Mm-hmm. And so you have a very organized campaign that makes calls, that threatens or promises donations to the university in the order of sometimes millions of dollars of donations toward their endowment that are being threatened to be pulled. And so, you have that on one side and a pretty unorganized ad hoc appeal to people's, morality or freedom of speech on the other. And, money and organization wins in these cases. And so universities are really acting on what is their incentive, which is to keep their donors and to not be bothered by hundreds of calls. And so what I implore Muslim and Arabs and anyone of conscience to do, especially if your child is attending a university, you are paying that tuition and they need tuition just as much as they need, these huge donations. Mm-hmm. You have to call into your university, or even if you're just an alum and you don't have a child, call the dean of students, call the president of the university and express your sincere concern for the climate of the university and the safety of Muslim students. This is not a theoretical. We have had one student stabbed on Halloween by someone wearing an Israeli flag at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. We have had 3 young men shot because of what they were wearing. This is not a theoretical. We have to be calling and raising these issues with universities so that our concerns are taken just as seriously.
Right, but Dalia, Muslims in the U.S. have been living there for decades. If not, at least, there have been migrants from the Balkans who moved to the U.S. 100 years ago. Why have Muslims in the U.S. not been able to organize themselves better, to establish lobby groups or pressure groups, to improve their visibility, to push, to lobby congressmen for their cause, to improve their rights and their living, their standard of living?
Harun, you're asking a very important question, and I invite folks to understand a few things. One, Muslims in the United States are very diverse. We are the most diverse religious group in the United States. We don't have a single majority race or ethnicity or national background. What that means is that it's both a strength and also a challenge. And the challenge with it is that we have so many different issues that we care deeply about. And so it's very difficult to focus on just one issue. When you have a group that is focused entirely on the defense and the promotion of one country, i.e. Israel, then they're going to be much more coherent and focused than Muslims in general, who have so many different things that we're dealing with. We're dealing with Palestine, we're dealing with Kashmir, we're dealing with the Uyghur crisis, we're dealing with Myanmar, we're dealing with Muslims in India, and I could go on and on. So that's one challenge. The second challenge is, despite the fact that you are absolutely right, Muslims have been in the United States for a very long time, but in terms of critical mass, the numbers that would make it possible to kind of organized, it has not been that long. It has not been as long as other groups. And we're still building, we're still learning. But we have a long way to go, but we've also made a great deal of progress from, just 20 years ago. I do see a difference, having lived through the aftermath of 9/11 versus now. There's a lot that we have in place that was not there just 22 years ago. We do have lines of communication with our leadership in the political sphere. We do have organizations that are able to respond more quickly. We have more people that are able to speak to the media than we did before. And we have young people. I want to raise up our young people. We are, as a religious community, the youngest average age of any group by 20 years. So we have a huge percentage of our population that is young, 18 to 29, more than any other group, basically almost 3 times the size of any other group. And these young people, I really admire them so much. They are absolutely fearless, and they are not waiting for an invitation. They do not see themselves as guests in our country, as sometimes their elders did. They feel a great deal of ownership and right to speak out just as much as anyone else. And it's this group that is really leading the way right now on college campuses, which is exactly why they're being silenced, because they are so fearless and they are so effective. I want to draw your attention to some hopeful signs. As much as it feels like we're overpowered, when you look at some polling by age group, so when you look at where people's sympathies lie, when there's a question about are the actions of Israel justified in Gaza, there was a question like that asked several weeks ago, and it was broken down by age group, and it was really telling because 65-year-olds and above, more than 80% of them said that the actions of Israel was justified.
Yeah, but Generation Z had a different opinion.
What's that?
Generation Z had a different opinion.
Different opinion, very different, right? So 18 to 34-year-olds, right, the percentage was only 27%. Right. And so you have this huge difference, a generational chasm between, young people and older folks on how they see this issue. And one of the key differences between these two generational cohorts is where they're getting their media. Young people are turning to social media. They're looking at Instagram and TikTok, which is why there's so much effort to silence people on social media. But that's where they're getting their media. They're getting their media from people on the ground. They're getting their media from other humans who are speaking freely, versus older people are getting their media from legacy media, mainstream media, TV, right, Fox News, CNN, and therefore are getting a very different point of view that obviously favors Israel as it traditionally has. But there is hope, because now you can't just silence any other voice. There is this opportunity for social media to be a source of alternative points of view.
Now, you touched upon it very briefly, but I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate. I mean, do voices of young Muslim activists, intellectuals, professors such as yourself ever make it to mainstream American media outlets? And if you could choose between having your voice heard on cable TV or on TikTok or Instagram, what is more important at this moment for Muslims to have their voice heard, bearing in mind that what you just talked about, the Generation Z having having the most expressed pro-Palestinian stance compared to the older generation?
So Harun, it's not a choice. We have to do both and everything. We can't allow any outlet to not have us speak. But it is much harder to be featured on mainstream media. Having said that, I have not seen more Palestinian voices featured on mainstream media than I have now. I have seen folks that are completely silenced, are almost never heard from, featured on mainstream media. Piers Morgan, I mean,
yes.
As sometimes as enraging as he can sometimes be in terms of his bias, he has featured some really phenomenal pro-Palestinian voices that we have never heard on mainstream media. And I honestly commend him for that. And I commend any mainstream media that is brave enough to bring Palestinian or pro-Palestinian voices to the forefront. I myself have, been reluctant, honestly, to speak on this issue because I am not Palestinian, and I would rather center the voices of Palestinians if it comes to speaking directly about Gaza and what is happening there. Where I feel more comfortable is you asked me to speak about American Islamophobia, and that's something that I study and work on every single day, so I feel qualified. But in general, I do think that there's an opening that I've never seen before in terms of even mainstream media bringing in Palestinian voices. Right. But we all have to keep speaking in any outlet, in all outlets, social media and traditional media. Right.
But if you see Bassem Youssef, his interview with Piers Morgan getting 12 million views in 48 hours, there is clearly a thirst for a second opinion within the US.
Absolutely. That you're very good example. I believe it was the most watched interview that they've ever had. So there is a thirst, there is an interest. I think people are tired of hearing only one side and are interested in hearing the other side. And if you're on social media at all, you're going to see this carnage. 20,000 human souls have been taken, and all you're hearing on your TV is that only one side has suffered. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't work. It's not logical. And so I'm heartened by the fact that, despite the incredible bias of mainstream media in my country, in the United States, despite that, you still have 66% of Americans favoring a permanent ceasefire, 2/3 of Americans seeing through mm-hmm. this smoke and mirrors and seeing the truth. And this is in direct contrast. 66% of the American public, 80% of Democrats sharply disagreeing with the official policy of the White House, and it really shows you that this is not the will of the American people. American policy toward this conflict, this assault, this genocide does not reflect the will of the American people.
Mm-hmm. And Dalia, moving on to Europe, in light of escalating manifestations of Islamophobia and the rise of far-right nationalism in Europe, we saw Geert Wilders recently elected, win elections in the Netherlands. What underlying factors contribute to this entrenchment of these, prejudiced ideologies within contemporary European societies? And is the rise of far-right nationalism, is it something that worries you as an American Muslim?
The rise of far-right nationalism worries me a great deal. And unfortunately, it's happening across the world, in Europe, even in Latin America with the recent election in Argentina, in the United States. And, I am not an expert on far-right nationalism or what breeds it, but what I have observed just as an ordinary citizen is it coincides with a number of things. One is declining economic conditions. That's certainly the case in Argentina, mm-hmm. and high inflation and so forth. And people want an outsider to come in and change things. They are tired of the status quo. They're tired of the so-called establishment, and they want someone new that they believe will make a difference. And so part of it is this economic anxiety that people mm-hmm. have. A second thing is that an aging population is seeing immigrants come in that don't look like them, and their fear of sort of an identity, their identity being lost in their country, is being preyed on and exploited by these figures. And they're told, we'll go back to some perfect time in the past, make America great again, make Europe great again, where you were secure, where you had a great life, and these, you know, so-called immigrants or people that aren't like you aren't threatening your way of life. And so there's definitely this preying on nostalgia and on ignorance. So often, many of these people simply don't know a Muslim. They don't know a person from another culture. And that kind of ignorance is being exploited to push xenophobia and Islamophobia. But you know, Harun, I want to emphasize one thing that I think is incredibly important. I've studied Islamophobia deeply and from an empirical perspective, not just a historical perspective. And what I find in the data is this: Islamophobia is not an isolated phenomenon. It grows with other types of prejudice, including and especially anti-Semitism. So what is so ironic is that while Islamophobia is often funded and fueled by people who claim to care about the Jewish people, they're actually harming Jews, because Islamophobia and anti-Semitism grow together. They are two branches on the same tree. It also grows with other types of prejudice, including anti-Black racism. So Islamophobia is a threat to everyone, not just to Muslims. The other thing that Islamophobia is linked to is authoritarian views, is anti-democracy. So if you care about freedom in your country, if you care about the rights of minorities in your country, if you want a country that is safe for everyone, you must fight Islamophobia just as much as any Muslim would.
Dalia, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you, Harun, for having me.